The world is heading toward accelerated extinction. This is the population pyramid of Europe. This one here is China's. And this is one of the most talked about cases of all, Japan. Birth rates in developed countries are already approaching 1, which means that each future generation will have half the population of the previous one. At this rate, we're facing a demographic collapse that will be the greatest crisis ever seen by humanity. However, there is a ray of hope. Amidst a global decline in birth rates, Israel is the great exception in the developed world, with a rate of 2.83 children per woman. In other words, it not only exceeds the minimum threshold for maintaining its population, but does so by a wide margin. This is so unusual that Israel is the only developed country where the population continues to grow without the need for immigration, and its birth rate is practically the same as it was back in the 1980s. And keep in mind, this is not just a religious issue. Although it's true that ultra-Orthodox Jews have 10 or 12 children each, the reality is that the rest of the population, even non-believers, have maintained very stable birth rates over the past 45 years. What Israel has achieved is literally a miracle, a global exception that could be crucial to preventing demographic extinction. So what has Israel done to avoid population collapse? How do religion, the economy, and war affect its birth rate? And the most important question of all, can developed countries learn anything from Israel? Today on Visualeconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. If we want to know the secret to Israel's success, we first need to understand why birth rates are falling in the rest of the world. And the answer is that there are many factors. But one of the most talked about is the incorporation of women into the labor market. It's common sense. The more women work, the less time they have to raise children. It's as clear as day, right? Well, the truth is that it's not so clear. There are countries with lots of women working and low birth rates, but there are also countries with lots of women at home and equally low birth rates. And although decades ago there did seem to be an inverse relationship, this does not explain the situation in Israel, because keep in mind, it's not exactly that Israeli women hardly work. If that were the case, then women in South Korea, who have 15% less labor force participation than Israeli women, should have a lot more children, but they don't. They have almost 4 times fewer. And don't think that Israeli women only work in jobs where it's impossible to have a career that would take them away from motherhood. Not at all. Israel is one of the countries with the highest number of university graduates in the world. 42% of the population between the ages of 24 and 64 has a degree, and 60% of them are women. On the other hand, housing does not explain the phenomenon either. According to a 2022 study, the square meter cost of new construction is $6,700. That's higher than in Germany or France, where it's around $4,800. And that's despite the fact that Israel's GDP per capita is much closer to Spain's than that of Germany or France. And yet, Israel continues to have more children. How can this be? This is where the twist comes in. Something that would be a problem in other countries may just be crucial in the case of Israel. The key lies with the grandparents.
Since Israel is small and densely populated, grandma is never far away. In one survey, 83% of secular Jewish mothers aged 25 to 39 said they were supported by their child's grandparents, whereas only 30% of German mothers said the same.
Israel is one of the countries where grandparents help the most with raising children. And yes, I know what many of you are thinking, but come on, Josh. In Mediterranean companies, there are also very strong family units, and it's also very normal for parents to leave their children with their grandparents. But the birth rates in these countries are at rock bottom. And yes, that's true, but take note, this is only one piece of the puzzle. The interesting thing is that in Israel, grandparents don't just take care of their children, they also invest in them, and a lot. Instead of waiting to leave their children an inheritance when they are no longer around, many older Israelis dip into their savings while they are still alive to help their children buy a home as soon as possible. The goal? For them to become independent quickly, and with a little luck, to hurry up and give them grandchildren. Is this what makes the difference? Partly, but it's not the only factor. Because if raising a child takes a village, the state also plays a role. And that brings us to the next big question question, can the state help you have more children? The answer is complicated, but we could say yes, with some caveats. Of course, there's a positive correlation between birth subsidies. Nevertheless, it's not that simple. On the one hand, not all subsidies are the same. Viktor Orban's Hungary spent 5% of its GDP on boosting the birth rate, and achieved absolutely nothing. The main mistake was to focus on the first child, helping families to have a child they were going to have anyway. The problem with the birth rate is not whether or not to have children, but how many children to have. Instead of encouraging existing families to have a second or third child, money was wasted on helping first-time parents. But even if a better system were designed, there would be another problem: the cost. According to demographer Lyman Stone, Taiwan would have to spend between $12,000 and $15,000 per child each year to reach the replacement rate. How much is that? Between 9 and 22% of GDP. Truly outrageous. Be that as it may, the truth is that there's no need to argue whether or not these subsidies are important. Let's go back to this chart, but now let's add Israel. As you can see, this country is pretty much in line with other developed countries in terms of government assistance. If Israel offered much more money to women with children, then we would have to discuss whether that money really makes them have more children. But since it offers a totally average amount, it's clear that this cannot be the explanation. And yes, we are taking into account indirect aid, such as paternity or maternity leave, which is also nothing to write home about in Israel, at least not compared to Europe. Also, think about it this way: the Nordic countries are famous for having a huge welfare state and many family-friendly policies. Yet, all these countries have birth rates well below those of the US, which is famous for doing just the opposite. So, the key to birth rates is not here. That said, there is one form of public assistance that may have been a key factor in Israel. Did you know that in vitro fertilization is practically free in the Jewish state? In 1994, the Israeli parliament approved public health and private insurance coverage for in vitro fertilization treatments up to the second child. As you know, this technique becomes less reliable and much more expensive as women get older, but the Israelis did not impose any age criteria. The result is there for all to see. The use of this technology skyrocketed, and these days, Israel is the world leader in this field. In 2010, Israel performed 4,400 cycles per million inhabitants, which is 1,500 more than Australia, the country with the second highest use of this assisted reproduction technique. The result? It's estimated that this policy led to a 30% increase in the number of children per woman before the ages of 41 and 47. Today, 5% of all births occur thanks to this technology. That's not insignificant, but it still doesn't explain Israel's demographic boom. Keep in mind that thanks to the popularization of this technique, many young women decided to delay the age at which they have children. So, part of that 30% growth in older women is offset by fewer children among younger women. In any case, the time has come to stop looking at the economy and start looking at culture. Some analysts have defined Israel as a demographic battleground between Jews and Muslims. I don't think I need to explain the reasons why. And pay attention, because this idea does not belong to just a few analysts. Take a look at the words of David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister.
For the survival and security of the state of Israel, a higher birth rate and increased immigration are essential. He likened Jewish women with less than 4 children to draftees who evade military service.
Clearly, there's a problem with this hypothesis. South Korea and Ukraine are two other countries that have also been under intense pressure to have more children for military reasons, but in both cases, the birth rates have plummeted. It must be said that these cases are very difficult to compare, but it is possible that in Israel, where there's greater coexistence within the same territory, the pressure to have more children than other ethnic groups is greater. And do you know what? There is evidence to support this. A 1996 study looked at birth rates in electoral districts that tended to vote more for nationalist parties. The result? Nationalism was indeed a much better predictor of the number of children than religion. Incidentally, many people also try to explain Israeli birth rates with religion, but this explanation falls somewhat short. For starters, the birth rate among secular Jews, those who do not believe in or practice the Jewish religion, has remained just as stagnant as that of other religious groups, although it is true that it is slightly lower. But Israel is not as religious a country as most people think. According to several surveys, between 40 and 50% of Jews do not fast during Yom Kippur, and 60% only go to the synagogue once a week or less. Returning to the previous topic, most experts ultimately agree on one thing. Israel is avoiding demographic winter for cultural reasons, whether due to religious heritage, the trauma of population loss in the Holocaust, or competitive pressure as the majority ethnic group. Culture explains birth rates much better than economics does. According to another survey, even non-religious Jewish women want to have 3.1 children on average. When European women are asked the same question, they respond with 2.2. In practice, they have far fewer, but we don't exactly know why. But Visualeconomik community, if we stopped here, the video would still be somewhat incomplete. I don't know, the answer doesn't seem very satisfactory. Luckily, there's still one detail that could help us explain how Israel has weathered the demographic winter. But in order to explain it, we have to pack our bags and fly from Tel Aviv to China. I'm sure you're all familiar with the one-child policy. What you may not know is that Mao's communist China conducted other experiments with birth rates before settling on that policy. One of them was the Later, Longer, and Fewer campaign. To sum it up, it was a campaign to reduce the birth rate. But here's the important part. This campaign only applied to ethnic Han Chinese, who are the majority ethnic group. And believe me, the campaign was a success. The birth rate among the Han fell by 0.8 children per woman, which is absolutely crazy. Now, let me ask you, what do you think happened to the birth rate of other ethnic minorities? Well, take a look. It turns out that these minorities also had fewer children. But what is really significant is that the minorities with the most contact with the Han ethnic group, which was required by law to have fewer children, were also the ones who reduced their birth rate the most. It was as if, being a very small minority surrounded by a majority, they decided to imitate what the majority does. A social contagion. Do you follow? Or to put it another way, birth rates can vary simply through cultural imitation. If you're surrounded by people who have a lot of children, then you're more likely to have more children yourself. In part, this phenomenon was due to the fact that, naturally, as the Han had fewer children, they devoted more resources to each child. Above all, more education. So if other families wanted to compete with those children, they also had to reduce the number of children they had in order to devote more resources to educating a few children very well. But watch out, because this phenomenon also occurred among minority ethnic families who had very low-paid jobs and were never going to be able to compete with the Han Chinese. With all this in mind, now think again about how something very similar could be happening in Israel, but in the opposite direction. Instead of reducing the birth rate, cultural imitation could be leading families to imitate what they see. Other families where it's normal to have 3, 4, or 5 children. Of course, this happens in all countries, but only in Israel do all the factors we've been discussing come together and reinforce each other through this social contagion. Now, this doesn't mean that the birth rate in Israel will remain so high forever. Immigration is becoming increasingly important, and although it's happening slowly, the number of children per woman in many groups, such as secular Jews, is beginning to fall. In fact, back in 2002, Jewish women usually had their first child at age 27, but today they are over 28 and a half. As they would say in Game of Thrones, winter is coming, although clearly it will arrive much later in Israel. Now that we've come this far, it's your turn. Did you know that Israel had the highest birth rate of all developed countries? Do you think the most important factors are economic, or alternatively, is the key to be found in the local culture? You can leave your answers down in the comments. Don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you like this video, give it a like, and I'll see you next time. Take care. See you soon.